Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum dear Sebastians and welcome back again. My dear students, up till now we have covered our second chapter, that is diffusion and osmosis. And today we will talk about the summary of this chapter, which includes diffusion, osmosis, osmosis in the cell, osmosis in the animal cell, osmosis in the plant cell, uptake of the water by the plants, active transport of the ions in the root hair cells, and active transport of glucose in the small intestine. My dear students, starting with the diffusion, as we have discussed, that diffusion is the net movement of molecules from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration. That means in diffusion, molecules move from the higher concentration to the lower concentration down the concentration gradient. And this is the example of the passive transport. Talking about the osmosis, as osmosis is a special kind of diffusion, because in osmosis the involvement of water molecules and the partially permeable membrane, that makes it special kind of diffusion. And in osmosis we know that the water molecules move from the higher concentration to the lower concentration down the concentration gradient through a partially permeable membrane. My dear students, through a partially permeable membrane. And we know about the partially permeable membrane, that it is a membrane which allows some selective molecules to pass through it. So that was all about the osmosis. My dear students, osmosis and diffusion, they are the example of passive transportation. Passively molecules move from higher concentration to the lower concentration. Then we talked about the osmosis in the cells. Osmosis takes place in the cells because cell has a very thin cell surface membrane, which is called the cell membrane around it, and that cell membrane acts as a partially permeable membrane, and the water molecules, they move across that cell membrane into the cell and sometimes out of the cell. Then we talked about the osmosis in the animal cells, and in that lesson we took the example of the red blood cell, and we have observed that if we put the red blood cells in a hypotonic solution, it swells up and bursts. And if we put the red blood cell in a hypertonic solution, it becomes crenated and it becomes shrink. And in that video lesson we have talked about the isotonic, hypertonic and hypertonic solutions. Isotonic solutions contains the same, in isotonic solutions the water potential is same as that of the cells, and if we talk about the hypertonic solutions, the water potential in hypertonic solution is high as compared to the cells. And if we then we talked about the hypertonic solutions. In hypertonic solutions the water potential is low as that of the cells. So I hope you have got the concept and idea about the hypertonic, isotonic and hypertonic solutions. Then we discussed about the osmosis in plant cells, and in that lesson, as we have discussed, that around the cell, around the plant cell, there is a tough rigid cell wall of cellulose is present, and that resists the changes in the shape of the cell against the pressure which is present outside or maybe inside the cell. And in that video lesson we have discussed that if we put the plant cell in a hypotonic solution, it will put the pressure around the walls, around the cell wall, and during that pressure it will swell up, and that condition is called as the turgid condition. And if we put the plant cell in a hypertonic solution, the water comes out of the cell and it will become flaccid, and ultimately it will lead to the plasmolysis of the cell. My dear students, in the next lesson we have discussed about the osmosis and the water uptake by the plants, and in that lesson we studied that water is taken up from the soil to the aerial parts of the plants through the root hair cells, and as the water concentration is, or you can say that the water potential in the soil is comparatively high as compared to the root hair cells, water moves from the soil into the root hair cells, and from that root hair cells that water moves across the root cortex and reaches into the xylem of the plant, and that through that xylem it is transported to the other aerial parts of the plants. Then, my dear students, we have talked about the active transport, which is actually opposite to the passive kind of transportation. And in the passive transportation we have studied the two examples like osmosis and diffusion. In that osmosis and diffusion, water molecules move from the higher concentration to the lower concentration, but in the active transportation the molecules move from the lower concentration to the higher concentration. As it is opposite to the passive transport, the molecules move from the lower concentration to the higher concentration against the concentration gradient. And in that case we need energy, and in that case energy is needed, and that energy is provided in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is a byproduct of the respiration. So, my dear students, during the active transport, the molecules they move against the concentration from the lower concentration to the higher concentration, and in examples of these active transportation we have talked about the movement of ions in the root hair cells. As in the root hair cells the ions are more as compared to the ions which are present within the soil, but these ions are needed, they are needed to be accumulated in the cell, root hair cells or the other parts of the plant, so they are actively transported inside the cell. In the last we have discussed about the example of the active transport, that active transport of glucose in the intestine. As the concentration of the glucose in our ileum is comparatively low to the other as the other part of our body has a higher concentration of the glucose, but that glucose is actively transported to the other parts of our body, and in that purpose of course energy is needed. My dear students, that was the summary of the whole chapter we have covered in these weeks. In the next video we will start our new chapter. Till then, take care of yourselves and the people around you. Allah Hafiz.